Silence in this room does not mean safety. It means waiting. London, 19th century. You climb the stone stairs, and the smell rises with you. Iron, damp wood, something sweet and wrong. In the center, a table. On it, a body. Around, dozens of eyes. Students, doctors, spectators. This is not a hospital. This is an anatomical theater. Here they watch how they are cut. Sometimes not quite dead. One movement of the knife, and the mistake is no longer corrected. Screaming here is not an exception. It is part of the training. Now ask yourself, if you were on this table, would you be able to survive science? This is not a horror story. This is history. When the door closes from the inside, you can still leave. It's important to understand this right now, before your hand has touched the cold railing, before the stairs down have changed the smell of the air. But the people around you are no longer thinking about leaving. They didn't come here as spectators. They came as witnesses. The stone walls of the anatomical theater are undecorated. There are no icons, no flowers, only concentric rows of benches rising upwards, as if in an amphitheater for execution. In the center is a table, wooden, with dark stains that no longer wash off. They are called traces of time, but everyone knows what they really were. You sit down. The bench is hard, tight, shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Someone is holding a notebook. Someone is a handkerchief, clenched too tightly in the fingers. The light falls from above, harsh, merciless. The gas lamps do not create comfort. They only expose. And that's when you understand the main thing. No one here asks if you are ready to look. Context: who, where, when, and why it is deadly London. Early 19th century. A city where medicine is developing rapidly, but the human body is still considered a resource. The law allows anatomists to work only with the bodies of executed criminals, but the executed are not enough, and the students are hundreds. And then the shadow market appears. The bodies of the poor, the lonely, those whom no one is looking for. The anatomical theater is the final stop, the last place where your body still has value. Here they don't ask who you were. Here they study how you are made. And if death has not come completely, no one stops the lesson. Immersion. Space, sound, smell. The first sound is metal. Quiet, dry. The tools are laid out on the table. The knife does not shine. It is dull, worn, working. The smell becomes stronger, damp, warm, with a hint of iron. Some turn away, but most look straight ahead. Because there is an unspoken rule here. If you look away, you could not stand it. And then the door closes, not loudly. Finally, the climax of the first chapter, the real moment. The body is covered with a cloth, not out of respect, so as not to distract. The professor comes to the center, calm, confident. His voice is even. He is not talking about death. He is talking about structure. And at that moment, someone in the audience hears a sound that does not fit into the lecture. Barely audible, like breathing. Pause. No one moves. The professor looks down and continues. Because if you stop, you will have to admit that on the table is not an object, but a person. Turn. An inconvenient truth. Most of the students sitting here will later become doctors, rescuers, authorities. But this moment is their initiation, the moment when they learn to turn off compassion. Not everyone can stand it. Some leave and never return. But those who stay leave something of their own here. End of the chapter. You sit silently. The light hits your eyes. The knives are closer than they seem. And for the first time, a real question arises. Not about science, but about survival. Because if today they are here, then tomorrow, couldn't you be here? This is not a horror story. This is history. When the door closes from the inside, you can still leave. It's important to understand this right now, before your hand has touched the cold railing, before the stairs down have changed the smell of the air. But the people around you are no longer thinking about leaving. They didn't come here as spectators. They came as witnesses. The stone walls of the anatomical theater are undecorated. There are no icons, no flowers, only concentric rows of benches rising upwards, as if in an amphitheater for execution. In the center is a table, wooden, with dark stains that no longer wash off. They are called traces of time, but everyone knows what they really were. You sit down. The bench is hard, tight, shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Someone is holding a notebook. Someone is a handkerchief, clenched too tightly in the fingers. The light falls from above, harsh, merciless. The gas lamps do not create comfort. They only expose. And that's when you understand the main thing. No one here asks if you are ready to look. Context: who, where, when, and why it is deadly London. Early 19th century. A city where medicine is developing rapidly, but the human body is still considered a resource. The law allows anatomists to work only with the bodies of executed criminals, but the executed are not enough, and the students are hundreds. And then the shadow market appears. The bodies of the poor, the lonely, those whom no one is looking for. The anatomical theater is the final stop, the last place where your body still has value. Here they don't ask who you were. Here they study how you are made. And if death has not come completely, no one stops the lesson. Immersion. Space, sound, smell. The first sound is metal. Quiet, dry. The tools are laid out on the table. The knife does not shine. It is dull, worn, working. The smell becomes stronger, damp, warm, with a hint of iron. Some turn away, but most look straight ahead. Because there is an unspoken rule here. If you look away, you could not stand it. And then the door closes, not loudly, finally. The climax of the first chapter, the real moment. The body is covered with a cloth, not out of respect, so as not to distract. The professor comes to the center, calm, confident. His voice is even. He is not talking about death. He is talking about structure. And at that moment, someone in the audience hears a sound that does not fit into the lecture. Barely audible, like breathing. Pause. No one moves. The professor looks down and continues. Because if you stop, you will have to admit that on the table is not an object, but a person. Turn. An inconvenient truth. Most of the students sitting here will later become doctors, rescuers, authorities. But this moment is their initiation, the moment when they learn to turn off compassion. Not everyone can stand it. Some leave and never return. But those who stay leave something of their own here. End of the chapter. You sit silently. The light hits your eyes. The knives are closer than they seem. And for the first time, a real question arises. Not about science, but about survival. Because if today they are here, then tomorrow, couldn't you be here? This is not a horror story. This is history. When the knife becomes the language of science. They don't speak loudly in this room, not because they're afraid, but because they're listening. The body lies motionless. The light falls directly from above, no shadows, no sympathy. Now it's the center. Everything else disappears. The professor doesn't look into the room. He doesn't need eye contact. He knows. Everyone is looking at him. Context. What a real autopsy looked like. No gloves. None of the sterility we imagine today. Hands are bare. The instruments are reusable. The same ones that were used an hour ago, and yesterday, and a week ago. The knife is not new. It's heavy, convenient, familiar. This is not improvisation. This is a practiced action. Immersion. First cut. The sound is not harsh, rather humid. Some in the room gulp air. Someone tenses so much that the wooden bench creaks. The professor speaks calmly, as if reading a prescription. He names the structures: muscles, tendons, vessels. Not a person, but a system. And that is where the danger lies. The real threat, when pain is still possible. In those years, a doctor could not always be sure of death, especially if the body arrived quickly, too quickly. There were signs, faint, uncertain, which were easy to ignore. Breathing could be too quiet, pulse almost imperceptible, and a mistake, fatal. Climax. The moment that broke the students. There are recordings, not legends, but lecture notes, about cases when the body moved. Fingers, jaw, chest. Reflexes, they said. Residual activity. But at that moment, someone in the hall was getting up. Someone was falling. Someone was not turning around anymore. Because if the body reacts, it means it is not completely silent yet. Turn. Why the autopsy was not stopped. Stopping the autopsy meant admitting failure. And failure in medicine at that time is not compassion. This is the end of a reputation. It is better to make a mistake in silence than to question the system. Science demanded victims, and it received them. Immersion. What the viewer felt. You sit and do not know where to look. Closing your eyes means losing control. To watch means to remember. The smell becomes thicker, warmer. It settles in your throat. You are no longer a guest. You are part of the process. The finale of the chapter. As the autopsy continues, the main question disappears. Is it right? Another remains. And if today he is here, then who will be here tomorrow? Because in this hall, they learn not only to cut. Here they learn not to stop. And this is what makes the anatomical theater not a place of science, but a place where only the one who is not next on the table survives. This is not a horror story. This is history. The scandal that could not be hidden. At some point, even London stops being silent, not because sympathy has awakened, but because fear has come out. Context: when the city began to suspect. In the early 19th century, rumors spread slowly, but they were stubborn. People noticed strange things: graves that sank the next day, coffins that were lighter than they should have been, bodies that disappeared before the funeral. At first, they blamed it on looters, then on criminals. But gradually, a more terrible question arose: and if the problem wasn't at night, but in the hospitals? Drowning, a real-life case, 1803. One of London's anatomical theaters, the body is rushed in. Too fast, even by their standards. The man is a poor worker. He died in the hospital. No relatives, no complaints, at least officially. During the preparation, one of the students notices something strange. The skin is still warm. The joints are not stiff. He talks about it, quietly, uncertainly. The professor listens and waves it away. The climax, a moment that cannot be ignored. The autopsy begins, and almost immediately, a sharp movement of the chest. Not a reflex, not a spasm. Breath. Someone in the hall shouts. Someone pushes the bench away. Someone runs to the door. But it is too late. The process has already gone too far to stop it without consequences. The man dies on the table. Not from illness, not from crime, from science. Turn. Why did it become known? This time, someone did not keep quiet. The student leaves the theater and goes not home, but to the press. The newspapers do not write the details, but they write the main word: alive. London reacts instantly. Crowds gather near the theaters. People demand answers. Because now fear has become personal. The real danger, trust, is destroyed. The poor are afraid of hospitals, of shelters, even help, because any cough, any fainting can be the beginning of the path not to recovery, but to the table. The doctor is no longer a savior. He is a possible mediator. The end of the chapter. The scandal did not destroy the anatomical theaters. It only made them more careful. The bodies began to be examined longer, formally. But the main thing has not changed. Haste was still better than doubt. And now the question is different. Not whether there was a mistake, but how many such mistakes remained unnamed. Because if one case came to light, how many remained in the dark? This is not a horror story. This is history. When death become entertainment. Fear passes faster than shame. London has proven this more than once. After the scandals, the anatomical theaters did not empty. They filled up. Because now people came not only to learn, they came to watch. Context: how science turned into a show. In the 19th century, the line between education and entertainment was thin, especially where death was commonplace. Anatomical theaters opened their doors not only to students. Seats were sold. Invitations were passed out. Sitting closer meant seeing better. Seeing better meant telling later. And that was more valuable than any lecture. Immersion, the atmosphere before the start. The hall fills with noise, whispers, laughter, coughing. Someone is eating, someone is joking, Someone is betting unofficially. On the table, a covered body, as the main prop of the evening. The light slowly concentrates in the center, and the hall becomes silent, not out of respect, but out of anticipation. The real danger, when compassion disappears. When death becomes a spectacle, it ceases to be an exception. Students get used to it. The audience becomes numb. If a body suddenly moves, it causes not horror, but a reaction. Laughter, whispers, excitement, because now it's part of the show. Climax, the moment of degradation. There is evidence that in some theaters, professors enhanced the effect. Loud explanations, a pause before the cut, a look into the audience. Not because it was more effective for science, but because it kept attention. And the more attention, the more money, the more influence. Turn. Who was actually sitting in the hall? Not all the spectators were students. There were traitors, officials, people far from medicine. For them, it was controlled horror, without risk, without consequences. They looked at the body and went home alive. The finale of the chapter. When the lights go out, the body remains. When the hall empties, it is still there. And if death can entertain, then it is no longer a warning, it is a product, which means someone will definitely make sure that the supplies do not stop. And now the main question is, if death sells, then who is next on the window? This is not a horror story. This is history. When deaths start to help. At first, death came by itself. Then it was expected. Then it was planned. And then there were those who decided, if death is necessary, it can be slightly accelerated. Context. The shortage that created crime. Scandals did not reduce demand. They only made supplies unstable. The audience waited. The students paid. The professors demanded material. And then a logic appeared in this system which was no longer possible to stop. If there are not enough bodies, then someone has to provide them. Immersion, a new type of people. These were not doctors and not students. These were people without names in the protocols. Intermediaries. Those who knew where to find those for whom no one would come. Shelters, overnight shelters, street workers, one mug of gin, one warm place to sleep, one promise of help, sometimes the last. The real danger? When death ceases to be accidental. There are documented cases where deaths seemed too convenient. People disappeared without illness, without a history, without a family, and a day later, a fresh body appeared in the theater. Officially, a natural death. Unofficially, a deal. And the scariest thing is the system didn't ask how it happened. It only cared about one thing, that the body arrive on time. Climax. A moment of realization. At a certain point, the city understood. It's not about graves anymore. It's about the living. Because if the body is more valuable than life, someone will definitely start counting the difference. Rumors of suspicious caregivers appear, about people who last saw the victim, about strange deaths in shelters, and fear changes form. Now they are afraid not of the night, but of help. Turn. The silence of science. Anatomy theaters are silent. Professors refuse to comment. The notes become shorter. Because if you admit the truth, you will have to admit complicity. Better not to know. Better not to ask. Science chooses silence again. The end of the chapter. Now, death is not the end. It is part of a chain. And if you find yourself at the beginning of it, no one guarantees that you will live to see the natural end. Because in a city where the body has a price, life is just a delay. And the question becomes almost personal. How long can you stay alive when someone is already waiting for your body? This is not a horror story. This is history. When the body needs more than you are alive. There is a line beyond which you can no longer pretend. London crossed it quietly. No bells, no announcements. The word accidentally simply disappeared at one point. Context: from scarcity to planning. When bodies became a commodity, the question was not where to get them, but how to do it reliably. Grave robbing was risky. Hospitals were unstable. Asylums were supervised. A source was needed that was not dependent on death. And then someone said the obvious. If death doesn't come, it can be created. Immersion. First suspicions. People start disappearing differently. Not sick, not old, not the ones they were waiting for in the cemetery. Young, strong, lonely. Those who are easy to lure. Those who are not immediately sought. And almost immediately after the disappearance, a body appears in the anatomical theater in excellent condition. Too excellent. A real case, when the scheme gave way. In one of the districts, the neighbors noticed something strange. A house where the windows are always closed. Trolleys at night. The smell is not like garbage. The police go inside and find more than they expected. Bodies. Ready to sell. No names, no stories. Some with signs of violence, some without any. Because death could have been quiet. Too quiet. The climax. The truth that cannot be hidden. It becomes clear, these people did not expect to die. They were helped. And now the anatomical theaters find themselves at the center of an inescapable question. Who bought these bodies? Because if there is a seller, there is also a buyer. Turn. Fear changes the city. London explodes not with anger, but with panic. People are not afraid of the dark, but of strangers. Not of shelters, but of offers of help. Not of death, but of it coming sooner than it should. Locks are changed. Doors are not opened. Trust disappears. At this point, it becomes clear. The anatomical theater is no longer standing aside. It is the final link. And now the question is no longer one of morality, but of arithmetic. How many lives can be broken for science to move forward? Because if your body is a value and your life is an obstacle, do you have a chance to survive in a city that has learned to kill silently? This is not a horror story. This is history. When the city looks into the mirror. The courtroom is crowded, not because everyone is interested in justice, but because everyone is afraid of recognizing themselves in this story. Because it's no longer about bodies, it's about complicity. Context. A case that couldn't be hushed up. When a crime becomes too obvious, it's no longer called a rumor. The detainees are not vagrants, not loners. These are people with names, with addresses, with regular contacts with anatomical theaters. And for the first time on paper, a chain appears. Murderer to middleman to buyer. And this chain leads upwards. Immersion, the atmosphere of the court. The air in the hall is heavy, the same as in the theater. People are sitting tightly together. Someone is holding a hat like a shield. Someone looks at the floor. The accused are silent. They don't look like monsters. And that's what scares me the most, because they look like ordinary people. The climax, a question that lingers. The prosecutor reads the testimony. Names, dates, amounts. How much was paid? When they were brought? Who accepted it? And at some point, a phrase is heard that changes everything. They knew that these people were alive. There is silence in the hall. Not shock, but awareness. Turn. How the system defends itself. Anatomists deny intention. They talk about science, about progress, about necessity. They don't deny facts. They deny responsibility. Because to admit it means to admit that knowledge was built on blood that was not accidental and planned. Real danger. A sentence that does not save. The court makes a decision. Several people are convicted. Several are executed. The city is dying. But the anatomical theaters are not closed. They continue to work. More carefully. Quieter. Because the problem was not solved at the root, but on the surface. The finale of the chapter. The court answered the question, who is to blame, but never answered another. Was it necessary? And while the city is returning to life, the fear does not disappear. It simply changes its address. Because if justice only affected the lower links, then what remained in the shadows? This is not a horror story. This is history. The law that didn't restore peace. When fear becomes widespread, the government always does the same thing. It writes the law, not to heal, but to calm. Context: an attempt to set a limit, 1832. After years of scandals, trials, and panic, Parliament passes the Anatomy Act. On paper, a revolution. Now anatomists can legally work on the bodies of those who died in the workhouses and have no relatives. No night carts, no graves, no intermediaries. Science gains stability. The city is the official explanation, but people get a different feeling. Immersion, the reaction of the street. The poor read between the lines. If you die alone, your body is not yours. If you are weak, the state already knows how useful you will be after death. Hospitals are once again a place of fear. Shelters are a trap. Aid is conditional. Now you don't need a criminal to get on the table. It is enough to be useless. The real danger? The law does not mean safety. The law did not teach compassion. It only legalized the process. The body no longer needs to be stolen. It is simply expected. And if death used to be a risk, now it has become part of the system. A person lives with the awareness that after his last breath, his path is already determined. The turn. What has really changed is that anatomical theaters are becoming quieter, without spectators, without shows. But fear does not disappear, because now it is not in the dark, it is in the rules. And that scares me more. End of the chapter. The law closed one chapter, but opened another. Now the question is different. Can science be humane if it begins where human value ends? Because if your body is guaranteed to be needed, then are you really fully alive? Those who didn't want to become a body. When rules become law, there are only two options: to agree or to resist. And in London, there are those who choose the latter, even if the chances are almost nil. Context: fear as a new reality. After the law was passed, people no longer feared night trolleys. They feared papers, certificates, registers, signatures. Because now death is officially registered, and the body is automatically at the disposal of science. And for the poor, this means one thing: after death, you don't even belong to yourself. Immersion: how people tried to protect themselves. Some carried notes with them, pieces of paper with the inscription, "I do not consent." They were sewn to clothes. They were hidden under their shirts. They put it in their pocket near their heart. Others looked for relatives, any relatives, distant, forgotten. If only someone had the right to say no. There were also those who made agreements with their neighbors. If I die, don't leave me alone. The real danger? Resistance that doesn't work. Paper had no power. A note is not law. If there was no family nearby, the body was taken away. Sometimes despite the screams. Sometimes despite the promises. Because the system didn't see people. It saw categories. The climax: rare victories. And yet there were cases when intervention changed the course of events. A priest who arrived too quickly. A neighbor who made a fuss. A nurse who delayed the signature. These people didn't change the system, but they bought time, and sometimes life. Turn: who became the enemy? Those who defended the dead often became inconvenient to the living. They were ridiculed. They were ignored. They were called enemies of progress. For in a city where science had become an excuse, compassion seemed like weakness. Resistance existed, but it was fragile. One voice against the papers, one man against the law. And the question no longer sounds like a protest. It sounds like a whisper. Can an individual save themselves in a system that has already decided what will happen to you next? What was left after the tables? Anatomy theaters didn't disappear overnight. They just changed shape. No noise, no spectators, no round benches, but their logic remained. Context: a legacy they don't like to remember. Modern medicine owes a lot to the 19th century. Body maps, understanding organs, the surgeries that save lives today. It all began where the body was the material. Historians know this. Doctors know this. But they talk about it carefully, because progress has a dark side, and it's uncomfortable. Immersion: how fear became silence. Today, anatomy rooms are quiet, sterile, correct. But if you remove the light, if you turn off the lamps, the idea returns. The same table, the same expectation, the same question: was there consent? The real danger? Ethics born of fear. It is because of these stories that rules appeared. Consent, documents, commissions. They are not abstract. They are written in blood, not symbolically. because someone once did not have the right to say no. The turn. We are still close to that limit. Even today, medicine constantly touches the limit. When the body becomes data, when life becomes statistics, when benefit overshadows the person. And this is where the history of anatomical theaters ceases to be the past. It becomes a warning. The end of the chapter. We like to think that we have become better, and maybe that is true. But just because someone was once on the table without a choice, and if we have rules today, this does not mean that the line has disappeared. It has simply become thinner. And now the question is not in history. The question is, will we recognize the moment when science will once again start looking at the body before the person? Could you survive this? Imagine the lights go out. The hall is empty. The benches are silent. The table is cold. The anatomical theater is no longer open to the public. But it hasn't disappeared. It has simply become part of the foundation. Context. When history dies down, London moves on. The city always moves on. New buildings, new hospitals, new rules. But beneath it all, memories that can't be seen, bodies that no one has named, lives that have become examples, deaths that have become useful. Immersion, a last look. If you were born poor, without a family, without papers, if you were sick, or simply passed out in the wrong place, your path might not end in a cemetery. And on the table, under the light, in front of a silent hall, without malice, without hatred, simply because it was more convenient. Climax, personal awareness. The scariest thing in this story is not the knives and not the blood, but how quickly people learned not to see the person. Because when the system decides for you, your chance of survival does not depend on strength, but on chance. Turn. Why is it important now? We look back and say, it will not happen again. But history does not ask for permission. It only checks whether we remember its lessons. And every time, when benefit becomes more important than consent, when speed is more important than life, anatomical theater briefly returns. Finale. A question for the viewer. This was a real story, real danger, real past. Not about monsters, but about people. And now the last question. Not about London, but about you. If you had lived then, without a name, without protection, without choice, would you have survived it? This is not a horror story. This is history.